First of all, a bit of an apology. In my rush to get out of my final class yesterday afternoon, I left my Mac adapter in that room, so I've just hurriedly transferred my carefully prepared PowerPoint onto this PC. All we're missing are the pretty UCL headers and I think one image, so I hope it will work. So I am, in the traditional sense, not an ancient historian. I have no Greek, I have no Latin. I was trained in a Middle Eastern Studies department. I'm a historian of Iraq. I happen to work on the oldest bits, but I also happen to work on some of the newest bits too. So what I want to do today is think about what we mean by antiquity from the point of view of the Middle East rather than from the Mediterranean. And I want to say to you, my conceit running through this talk, I think, is that antiquity is like the ocean. It has great unplumbed depths. It is a single entity, and yet there are parts of it which are significantly different, have significantly different ecological systems in them to others. And that it is useful to look at the whole, but it is equally useful, and I would argue vital, to understand individual parts of it too. So, let's start with the first question. Antiquity is like the ocean. So how deep does it go if it's like the ocean? So Ian yesterday was talking a lot about the first millennium BC, and really talking in particular about the axial age, the period that begins in the 8th century, so the argument goes, in which there were many big changes across the whole of Eurasia. Now, from a historian of Iraq's point of view, 800 BC, pah! History, the writing begins in southern Iraq, also in Egypt, more or less 5,000 years ago. So we are talking deep time. In terms of prehistorians, I mean, I've taught students of the Paleolithic. You will say 3000 BC. Pah! Right? We are really skimming the surface of that deep ocean, however deep we think we go. Right? So, here is the period that Ian was talking about yesterday, the so-called axial age. And that is, thinking about in terms of ocean depths, a really great period to look across deep, wide spans of antiquity, because our ocean of antiquity is widespread to that depth. And indeed we can see, as the Middle East enters the axial age, those huge transitions in scale. So here is the Assyrian Empire, ruler of the Middle East in the early 1st millennium BC, at that point the largest empire the world had ever known. And hey, that looks pretty big, doesn't it? That's pretty much all of the inhabitable Middle East. And there are a couple of brief periods when it encompasses Egypt too. Then along comes the Persians, and watch Assyria shrink. There's our previous map. There is the Persian Empire. Right? So suddenly, my little part of the world, southern Iraq, looks incredibly insignificant on that scale. But what southern Iraq has going for it is incredible chronological depth. So, from the point of view of the material I'm working on at the moment, the axial age is not antiquity. It is the far future. It is 800 years in the future. For my guys, this is thinking about Star Trek. It's unimaginably a long time in the future. So what can we do with material from the early 2nd millennium BC? Let me give you a little example from the stuff. This is really, really fresh, right? So you think 1800 BC, that's an awful long time ago. Surely we must know everything there is to know about it already. Quite the opposite. There is new stuff coming out of the ground all the time. I was in Iraq just 3 weeks ago. I'm a member of a project that's run from the University of Manchester, jointly with the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, and partly funded by the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. I'm not myself an archaeologist. I leave that to the experts. I'm the one that reads the objects, the inscribed objects, as they come out of the ground. So it's an incredibly collaborative experience. There's Brits, there's Iraqis, there are professional archaeologists, there are academic archaeologists, there are students. and we are together trying to make sense in real time of what the diggers are finding. We've been going for 3 seasons now, a little brief one in 2013, 3 months last year, 2 months this year. We picked the site, or the dig directors, Jane Moon, Robert Killick and Stuart Campbell picked the site because it was of a manageable size. They picked it also because aerial photography showed very close to the surface a very large building that looked accessible and unusual. So here it is at the end of last spring, and you can see, even just on the surface scrape, huge walls coming out of the ground, but also some rather peculiar little, particularly over there, you can see these little things that looked at first like buttresses turn out to be little external rooms, so they're rather mysterious. I will also point out that round thing in the middle, which I will get to in a second. Within a couple of days of their first digging, they hit clay tablets in cuneiform script. None of the diggers were cuneiform literate. I happened to be in the country at the time, and I was summoned down from Baghdad to read the tablets. Now that we've been going for 3 seasons, I can confidently say that we definitely have not just sort of random deposits of written stuff, but a very meaningful assemblage of written evidence. We're well into history. The tablets all come from 2 rooms in the big mysterious administrative building. This is a plan from the end of last season. We've now mapped out more. What you've got up all along the side here are rows of storage rooms, which were, we think, containing grain and other agricultural products. And that's definitely what the cuneiform tablets are telling us. So, this is hot off the press. It's not even in the press yet. You're the second lot of people I've talked to about this, and the first outside Iraq, so you're very, very privileged. We have a few dozen administrative tablets ranging in size from this big to this big. They're documenting well-managed but quite informal agricultural production centre. We see the same names of people coming up again and again. The managers of the community, or perhaps one single individual, are small in number. It's not a big hierarchy because there's no formal administrative apparatus on the tablet that give us names of gives us the names or titles of professional administrators. It seems to be a one-man band writing for himself, but nevertheless keeping very close track. And my favourite tablet actually is a list of three workers who have been behaving improperly. So we have to find out. I haven't quite finished reading exactly what they've done, but clearly there is discipline involved. So a small community, 30 or 40 men involved. They're distinguished from each other by their first names, and if they have synonymous first names, then the administrator uses a professional title such as carpenter or scribe or seal cutter, which shows that these are people not permanently involved in agriculture but are doing other things in the community too. So again, that's very, very helpful. Dating it is rather difficult but also very exciting, because both the tablets, the paleography of the script, but also the material assemblage of the objects coming out of the ground around them, tell us that this is from a period which is not meant to be literate. Famous King Hammurabi's successor and son Samsu-iluna lost the south of Iraq to a mysterious Sealand dynasty who ruled from somewhere in the marshes in either 1630 or 1730 BC, depending on your views about Middle Bronze Age chronology. And writing it is generally thought disappeared from the area. There are a small group of tablets illicitly excavated and sold on the antiquities market a few years ago that date to a 7-year period towards the end of that. Floating 3, we can't pinpoint it. And the reason we can't pinpoint it is that at this point in history, years were named rather than counted. So in order to know relative chronology, you have to know the sequence in which years were named after political events. And we don't have the lists for this period. We also know that in about 510 BC, administrators stopped naming years and started counting them as well. We have one very fragmentary year name in our little group of tablets, so that tells us that it must predate 510 and post-date either 1730 or 1630. We know that they are part of a much larger political system because we have 3 references to deliveries of grain to the palace. Now, if only they told us where the palace was, then that would be a major excitement, because that would solve the problem of where the Sealand dynasty ruled from. We think it's probably the city of Ur. But nevertheless, we've got then very new and exciting stuff about the organisation of society in a period which was traditionally thought of as being rather chaotic. Even better than that, though, is that just this, and these last couple of months, there is evidence for formal scribal training in this administrative building too. And this was completely unexpected. For small communities, you expect people to be learning on the job, learning the signs that they need to know in order to do their jobs. You don't expect them to be learning the formal sort of schooling that was happening in big cities, and that is in part of the indoctrination and creation of self-identity of scribal communities. But our guys, our mysterious administrators whom we don't yet know, were teaching one or more successors how to write not just words for grain and deliveries and badly behaved workers, but elephants and hippopotamuses and lapis lazuli and carnelian. And so their intellectual world is so much larger than their small brown agricultural world of southern Iraq. They're thinking about and dreaming about a much more beautiful, colourful, larger world, in common with their counterparts in the big cities before or afterwards. So that, for me, is incredibly exciting. What's lovely about this is the tablets, we know exactly, because we're working on them as they come out of the ground, exactly where they're found. The administrative tablets that you saw before are generally very complete. They had obviously been deliberately kept, and then the building had been abandoned and the tablets left in situ. They're in the building with this mysterious round installation, which is very typical recycling facility for clay tablets. Not typically baked in antiquity. When you finished with a document, it had run out of useful life, you chucked it back in the bin, put water on it, and sort of squished it down and made them again. So that's very typical, usually, of school tablets. Now, the bin itself was clean, but all the administrative tablets were found around here, and all of the school tablets had been broken up in antiquity and chucked in a corner over there. So it'd be like finding the sort of the bottom of a waste paper basket, basically. So again, very, very exciting to think about new horizons for literacy in at the end of a period that we know very, very well, extending the range there. So I said then, from my point of view at the moment, Axial Age really very modern. Even at this period, they were very, very aware that that the literate community was sitting on deep, deep antiquity. Some of you may know about the Sumerian King List. This is its most famous exemplar here in the Ashmolean Museum, but we have 20 or so manuscripts of it now. Now, I wonder if I can. I'm not familiar with PCs, so just bear with me a second. What I want to do is come to there. So the Sumerian King List exists in many versions, but it divides the past from the point of view of the early 2nd millennium BC into 2. The most recent part is just like the early 2nd millennium present. Let me find a bit that's not got too many variants in which kings rule for 20 years or 5. They rule in dynasties from particular cities. Kingship moves from city to city. Right. And that historical past, from the point of view of the early 2nd millennium BC, is a very deep one. Right? So here we are at line 300 odd, right, 350. But the past, the early 2nd millennium people understood, had not been going on like this forever. they divided the past into historical time like this, and then a time before the flood. And there we are. And that it was the flood that distinguishes historical, quantifiable time from what we might call prehistory or a golden age. And there are other myths, there are much more perhaps textually interesting myths than this, that describe the gods creating humankind in order to look after them, but failing to build in any sort of self-regulating mechanism for breeding or dying. So that population just keeps breeding, human population keeps breeding and breeding and breeding, and never dying, and so they become intolerably noisy to the gods, and the flood is a solution that the gods create in order to limit human population. And in this time then, kings rule for incredible lengths of time because they are, to all extents and purposes, immortal. So, for someone in the 18th century BC, they can see back very, very far in time too. Right, so we can say antiquity is like the ocean, it's variably deep. Antiquity is not quite like the ocean, in that we're not quite agreed as to where it stops, right? Where the surface of the ocean lies. And this is particularly the case for the Middle East, I think. Here are the standard textbooks in circulation at the moment, in use that Anglophone books that we set our students. Famously, Amelie Kurt's Ancient Near East, who says that the ancient... Oh, that should have been 330 BC, sorry, my typo. 330. Van der Meerup, a decade later, 323. Notice this is all about relinquishing the Middle East to Alexander the Great. Right? At this point, his Middle Eastern experts can stop and hand over to the classicists. French historian Francis Joannes begs to differ and says that the ancient Near East stops, Mesopotamia stops, with the last datable cuneiform tablet, 400 odd years later. And then, curiously, Liverani, most recently, rolls back from then and says, no, it's not the Greeks, it's not cuneiform, let's call a halt at the Persians. Right? So there may well be good pragmatic reasons for this, but it sends very clear signals to our students that Middle Eastern specialists can hand over at some point, perhaps with a big sigh of relief. An alternative, also recent, is a book called Ancient Empires from Mesopotamia to the Rise of Islam, which situates the Middle East in a Mediterranean and European context. It starts with Assyria in the first millennium BC, then sweeps west, and then comes back to the Umayyad dynasty, the first dynasty of Islam, and argues that that is the last of the ancient empires. So that's a very interesting take too, that's a very definite date, but then that's this very clear message that the Middle East is a precursor to European history. Karen Radner and I, a couple of years ago, ducked the question, or rather said the question wasn't a very useful one, and in fact, if we're going back to our ocean metaphor, then thinking rather about ecosystems within the past. And one natural cluster is to look at communities that bind together by particular writing cultures, because we are, after all, historians and think access the past primarily through the written word, even if, as cuneiformists, we see that written word as having very clear archaeological context and very clear material form. But what that doesn't do then is acknowledge multiple literacies, multilinguality and hybridity, which is it's particularly visible perhaps in the first millennium BC, but is present throughout Middle Eastern antiquity. I also think the problem of stopping with Islam is it then prevents one from looking at continuities. And one of my favourite courses to teach starts with the Assyrians and ends just with the coming of the Ottoman Empire, and looks at continuities and change in kingship and scholarship throughout that period. So, who owns the sea? Who owns antiquity? Questions for the Middle East are particularly complex and contested, and we've seen that no more so than in recent weeks, particularly since the release by ISIS of the videos of them trashing objects in the Mosul Museum. So, you've all seen media on this. Let me give you some examples of this sort of great sense of entitlement and ownership that appear in the mainstream media. So here is Boris Johnson saying that this is absolute outrage and that he's ready to bear arms and go and shoot them down as a result of the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. Since when has Boris cared about the Assyrian Empire? I don't know. I mean, he's well known for his classical interest, but this is the first time I've ever seen him in print expressing any opinion. What's interesting too, and I think what's deeply problematic, is he sees the past, the heritage of the past, as something that is essentially rightfully ours, or something British, right? There are the heroic Victorian explorers who rescued this stuff from the Middle East and took it safe to the British Museum in the 19th century. And then there are the rampaging iconoclasts of the Middle East today. There is no room in this story for the academic Iraqi, the educated member of the public, the person who just wants to go have a picnic on an ancient site. People own the past in the Middle East just as they do here, and there is a local right of access to this stuff. Jonathan Jones in The Guardian, on the very same day, was bewailing why there was a day in which news had been reported that Saddam's tomb had been trashed in fighting in Tikrit, and he wailed then about, why are we worrying about this when the whole of the Assyrian Empire has been destroyed? I've lost the link to that again because I'm not on my own laptop. And I remembered that just exactly a year ago, he had written this article also in The Guardian, really generally decrying Assyria, ending this. Egypt and Greece were civilizations. Assyria was not. Assyrian art is indeed cursed by the blood and gore it celebrates. Assyrian art itself casts an evil spell. So that's how much Jonathan Jones loves the ancient Middle East, right? Science Orientalism much, folks? We tend to think, oh God, 1978, been there, done that. And yet, we need to keep teaching it to our students. It is all pervasive. Middle Eastern antiquity is ours, the West's. Middle Eastern antiquity is corrupt and decadent. I also had, but you can find it for yourself, a tweet from the ancient historian Tom Holland. Again, that 3 days later. Is ISIS destroying everything I love? It's like, oh, come on. Your life, your home, your life, your family are completely safe. And really, it's not about us. If you want to know more, to hear more about my ranting about this week's TLS. I have a long rant in that, so I'll shut up about that now. I want to finish off by thinking a little bit about how we've got there, how it is that Anglophone men, white men, can claim ownership of the Middle Eastern past and forget that there are potential Middle Eastern claimants too. So, Ian was very usefully yesterday urging us to think about 18th century views of antiquity. 18th century views of antiquity hardly encompassed the Middle East. It's what was bits from the Bible, bits from the classics, but there were no primary sources. Art historian Frederick Burrer has called the Middle East a new antiquity. So although it is much deeper than other local antiquities, it is in fact incredibly new. And it has taken the Anglophone world, the Western world, an incredibly long time to come to terms with it. First discoveries fit in chronologically with Greece and Rome. Assyria predates them by a few hundred years. Okay, no big deal. Cuneiform script, when it's deciphered, corroborates a lot of stuff in the Bible, throws up some interesting anomalies. That's all okay. That all fits into the known picture. 1870s, major intellectual catastrophe in that southern Iraq starts to be explored. Archaeological techniques are such that we can no longer just looking for stone sculpture, but mud brick buildings become apparent too. And there's a whole civilization out there that the Bible and the classical world know nothing about, written in the Sumerian language and much, much deeper in time. It takes 30 years for Anglophone academia to agree that Sumerian is indeed a real language, that these are real people, and it's not just the Assyrians having us on. So, but hey folks, that's 115 years ago. We should have got over that by now. And yet, somehow not. Partly, the Brits are to blame. When, after the First World War, the Middle East was cut up into Iraq and Syria and other places, Britain was given the new country of Iraq to mandate into modernity, and to a large extent it was archaeologists in charge, because they were the ones who spoke Arabic, they were the ones who knew the region, and they were the ones, for better or worse, who were particularly fussed about accessing the region's past. Gertrude Bell had been phenomenally important in setting up the country and creating a very British-style monarchy there. But once all that was over, she was sidelined and given antiquities and heritage to look after. Sorry, some of the words have banged into her picture. And she very much treated it as her local fiefdom, and indeed the British Museum lobbied very, very hard that the British should retain a complete monopoly on excavation. She was sensible enough not to allow that, and allowed French and Germans and Americans in too, but made no attempt to train Iraqis. There were even, well after her death as late as 1935, an American commission decreed that Iraq was not ready for tertiary education, that a university would be more trouble than it was worth. And so history, archaeology, the constructing of the idea of the nation-state remained very firmly in Anglophone hands, and despite a great deal of public unrest and agitation against this. And if you're interested in this, Magnus Bernhardsson's excellent book, Mind blank, A Plundered Past, from 2005 is very, very good. So when the mandate ended in 1932, at last there was a chance for Iraqis themselves to establish their own sense of history. And ironically, it was a Yemeni, Sati al-Khusri, who'd been trained in the old Ottoman Empire and became Iraq's first Minister of Education and first Director General of Antiquities, who started to send the first generation away to be trained, not in formerly colonial countries, but in the United States, and the first to actually seriously explore the Islamic past of the country. And only once that had got underway, then started to go back further in time again to the, for instance, to the Arab city of Hatra, and then spending a lot of time, or particularly Taha Bakir, on the old Babylonian period, the early 2nd millennium BC during the Second World War. And then, to cut a very long story short, things got very messy under Saddam, when the ancient past became co-opted to create a sense of Iraq that was, in which Saddam was merely the latest in a long line of militaristic, heroic kings, whether Hammurabi of Babylon, Sennacherib of Assyria, or Salah ad-Din, the anti-crusader from the Kurdish north. And this involved, well, there were good reasons for this in some ways, in that trying to create an Iraqi identity that went beyond Shia and Sunni, beyond Christian and Muslim, beyond Kurdish speakers and Arabic speakers, a past that no one had privileged access to. But because it became so closely associated with their regime and had to fit in to that very totalitarian secret police state, it became very badly corrupted too. Used also against the Iranians, particularly in the Iran-Iraq war. Here you see Saddam either firing rainbows or Exocet missiles, depending on your preference, against the evil Iranians. Oh, I'm missing a picture. 2003, the war there didn't help very much either. A lot of the looting was either very anti-Ba'athist, people seeing the ancient past as very too much a part of the regime's propaganda, or unfortunate sort of collateral damage in the regime's own destruction of its records, and then lots and lots of archaeological looting in the aftermath, partly by criminal gangs and partly people who were just desperate to feed themselves and their families. Over the past 10 years in the south, things are gradually coming back together again, but it is still the case that I know far more about the history of ancient Iraq than almost any Iraqi. When I go to the country, my Arabic isn't good enough to talk to my colleagues in Arabic. It's not good enough to give lectures to students in Arabic. And so I'm still in this very asymmetric, privileged position, and it makes me very uncomfortable. So, let's wrap up. Morals and the story. So, antiquity is far bigger than any of us can possibly encompass, and it's all exciting and deep and rich, and there are huge, huge uncharted territories out there, even in parts of the world which we think are familiar. And I'm sure anyone who works on any other part of the world can point to similar lacunae that need filling. So our little project at El Khaibar is just creeping towards closing one of those little gaps. Local histories are just as important as the global. And by local histories, I mean histories for people who live there, not just for us. Right? Iraqis enjoy and value their local history just as we do. We mustn't forget that. And in fact, we have a moral obligation to help them access it. And I think this is also very important. I'm afraid this is the one point in which I beg to differ with Ian from yesterday. He was arguing very strongly that the Greco-Roman world is particularly important. I would simply say it is particularly familiar. If we go back to our ocean metaphor, it's part of the oceans that have been not overfished, but very heavily fished, let's say. Right? And just because it's close to us and near to us, it may seem important to us right now, but is it necessary? I would argue not. And I think it's just as important to get out into the unfamiliar territory and explore those too, and they may turn out to be just as important and exciting and confusing and fascinating as the familiar Greco-Roman world. This is important too. I think this is really important. I think we have particularly if we're working on antiquities of the world outside Europe. And even if we are, right? We are the privileged few. Right? We are the one. Our lives will never be at risk by what we do. Right? I have colleagues who have risked their lives. One in particular I'm thinking of, who went out when the Daily Mail had a stupid ISIS have destroyed the walls of Nineveh thing on the 31st of January. A colleague of mine got in his car and he drove around the walls of Nineveh in ISIS-occupied Mosul, just so that we could tell the Daily Mail they were wrong. Right? They're working without books. They're working without internet. They're working in incredibly difficult situations, and yet they continue to do that. Encouraging local communities and our own communities beyond academia to understand antiquity, to make it more accessible, can only be a good thing. Having a strong sense of your past is going to be nothing but good for social cohesion. It helps people understand the value of difference, rather than being frightened of difference, understanding that people are people despite their variety, and that there is value and interest to be had in learning from other people too. So, here's the plea then for going deep as well as for going broad, and for staying particular as well as exploring the general. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to have a roving microphone for questions so that it can all be properly recorded. But just to,
I thought I'd just done and I'm not.
just to say thanks to Eleanor, first of all, for a very important contribution to today. The challenge, as it were, to global history by putting a deep local history in amongst, maybe not in its place, but alongside it, I guess, is clearly very important. And there were many other aspects there. The indigenous perception of antiquity, I guess, the modern periodizations of antiquity are only just two other elements of the material covered here, and I think all of them very relevant to today. So any questions on any of those angles would be very welcome.
Thank you very much for the paper. That was really exciting, and new field work showing the local in this little gap, and a reminder that the ocean sometimes dries up in the middle in a strange way. That's really amazing material. It's quite close to the period I study in Egypt, so of course I'm particularly interested in it. But on a more general level, this relationship between the local and the global, it's a kind of an urban conceit, I guess, that we have, that the local isn't global. And you're showing that the two are imbricated in one another. There's this kind of enmeshing. At what point do you think the local is truly local? I'm thinking of kind of rural localities today, where usually they've been to more continents than I have, because they need the work and then they go home again afterwards. But I wondered whether you thought within these qualities of locality and global, there was something local that you could isolate away from the global, or are they too enmeshed?
I think they're it's just a question of how tight your focus is. Right, and change metaphors now. So yes, our little village, our Tel Haiber, our little excavation, we thought it was just going to be this little agricultural community. They weren't expecting tablets, right? And when we got tablets, I wasn't expecting them to tell us anything about other than that little world. In fact, we've got links to a palatial economy. The Scribal exercise tablets give us links to this incredibly large sort of world of the imagination. So, even at that scale, you can't help but have to acknowledge kingdoms and trade networks. Lapis, we've got, the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, for instance, and we've not yet done. We've actually got some semi-precious stone on site. We've not yet done the analysis that's going up. They've gone up to Manchester for that. It's just grubby coloured stone at the moment. We can't tell what it is, but that's not local. We don't. Local stone is limestone, right? So, again, I think even when we are studying sort of the palace, you can get so wrapped up in what's going on within the household. You can do both, I think, and I don't know. I don't think you can ever cut one off from the other. Because precisely you say that even now there's deeply connected things. That was a really rambling answer. Sorry.
Karina?
Can I just pick it up?
Well, I think
it needs to be recorded.
The recording might pick you up. Karina first.
Thank you. I was really interested about this relationship between what Syria happens to be portrayed as in the media as bloody, corrupt, violent, and what, the advancement of research that steps so far away from that. And the reason why I was wondering what you make of that relationship is because when you set up the slide showing the sort of chronology of the new antiquity as it was established in the 19th century, it reminded me that exactly at that point in time, Etruscan antiquity was being, properly fashioned almost as an academic discipline. And that's where the Etruscans began to appear to everyone's eyes as bloody, violent, oriental. And that bloodiness, violence, and oriental status of the Etruscans has remained in much of the literature, scholarly literature, because Etruscan archaeology is classical and therefore portrayed by the classical sources just like that. So there is almost a continuity that remains in the scholarship. So I was wondering what happens with the Middle Eastern archaeology.
I think the two trajectories are very, very much parallel. And the late 19th century, late the intellectual world of London and Paris and Berlin and places like that is one of increasing racial discourse. It's about the scientific study of race ever more so, whether it's through modern anatomy or the ancient past. And that, whether it's social Darwinism or nascent anti-Semitism, there's a lot of it about. And so that happens naturally. And one of the excitements of discovering the Sumerians is it's not a Semitic language, right? And therefore it can be claimed as this sort of pure origin without having to worry about. So there's huge arguments about whether the origins of civilizations are Semitic, i.e. Babylonian, and Assyrian, or non-Semitic, i.e. Sumerian. The newly created German state gets heavily involved in it, heavily invested in archaeological investigation in the Middle East precisely for this point too. So, and it's been, unfortunately, the history of archaeology has focused, generally speaking, on the first generation of pioneer explorers and decipherers, the heroic men who did the firsts of the 1840s and 50s. And there's beyond my own students' work and a few exceptions outside, very little historicisation of what happened. The idea is that you just discover it and then that's it, there is no history to write, right? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on how the past is constructed through the lens of late 19th century, early 20th century modernity.
But I'm still, baffled by this big disjunction between what the media make of Assyria, as you pointed out. I mean, I've read your piece in the TLS, and clearly the way that scholars speak to the media, as you do in the TLS, this is not like that. So I'm just baffled by this incredible disjunction.
Iraq is inaccessible. It's been inaccessible for 25 years. The UN international sanctions made Iraq a pariah state. So we can construct it, the West constructs it however they like. When they go to Iraq, they go to the green zone, right? In a tiny, tiny little bit of Baghdad, in which the rest of the world is described, the rest of the country is described as the red zone. Right? And if you're in the green zone, you're allowed out for 90 minutes at a time in an armoured vehicle with a flak jacket and a tin hat. I had to fight for 48 hours to be allowed to go and visit my colleague who runs the National Library when I stupidly accepted an invitation to stay at the British Embassy in Baghdad. Never again. I'm really weird in that I travel with Iraqis in the country. Right? People are increasingly doing that in Kurdistan, but beyond Kurdistan it's incredibly unusual. And so people,
There were several people who wanted to ask questions, and we'll have time to come back to this in the general discussion at the end. Okay, Maria, if you're no longer wanting to ask a question, then Maria is up next.
Yes, I was really interested in the way that you were presenting the importance of the local in relation to the global, and I wondered whether one other way of thinking about that relationship might be to say that there is a way of looking at the global with a God's eye view, that we look down from above and we think that we can see from above this spread of civilizations and this global antiquity, and that what you're adding to that in a way is also an opportunity to look at the global, but to look at the global from the local, that when you look from the local at the global, you might see it very differently.
It is.
So one of the issues for us is that we're looking at the global from our position in the Mediterranean, and that might make a difference to the way we see it.
Absolutely, it's one of my former colleagues in Cambridge always used to like to say, all knowledge is situated, right? And whether it's from above or below, or from the east or the west, we're going to just what is perceptible from that position is going to be different. And that's why we just need to keep talking to each other and telling each other what we see, and hoping it all joins up and makes some sort of sense between us. So I'm not saying that one is privileged over the other, but that they're all valuable, and that the panoptic is as important as the microscopic.
I mean, following that point about the, as you say, digging deep or going deep, in a way, how deep does antiquity go in that respect? Because if you dig really deep, then you're into a sort of a prehistory, which finally ends up, 100,000 years ago, and everybody comes out of Africa. So actually, you end up in another kind of panopticon view. But it's quite interesting to know not what the lateral spread is, but what does deepness mean?
Well, I mean, if we're talking as historians in terms of survival of legible text, if we take that crude... Well, I'm saying if we do, that's one measure of doing it, right? And that's...
But you don't in practice.
Well, I'm a historian, I do. I don't know anything about the Paleolithic period. I know that there were... the Shannon caves exist.
Now you have your objects. And as you say, you're excavating, you're visiting excavations.
Yeah, so...
involved in excavation, you're involved in material culture.
Yeah, but I always have been, yeah. But that's what Middle Eastern historians do, because all of our stuff comes out of the ground, right? We maybe have to be re-excavating it in museums, but we all work with material objects. That's one of the major differences between methodology of the classical world and the antique, is that it was lost for millennia, right? We don't have a continued tradition of learning. This is Burger's point. It all had to be rediscovered and it all had to come out of the ground. So, again, that just necessarily forces us in a different way of thinking, because we don't have a continuous tradition.
This is probably not on. If there are no immediate questions, so we have a lot of time for discussion at the end. We have more than an hour, I think, about an hour. So it might be a good idea to move on to our next speaker. But let's thank Eleanor again for a wonderful paper.